But you're into tech, and maybe you didn't know some of these. So these are just some of the tips that I know and that I do every time I use a smartphone camera, and maybe some of them might surprise you. The first one is in relation to macro photography. And did you know that in most smartphone camera systems, the ultra-wide lens is the one responsible for taking macro photography? It kind of feels counterintuitive because you would think the ultra-wide is the one that captures the most, and the most zoomed in camera would be the one that's used for, taking really close-up shots. But in reality, it kind of tends to be the opposite, as the ultra-wide is the camera that tends to be able to focus at the closest distance possible, and as such is often the one that's used. Not to be confused with the lower-end phones that oftentimes have a dedicated macro lens that's kind of just there as a cheap sort of get-out-of-jail-free card when it comes to claiming that they have 3 cameras or 4 cameras or 2 cameras, when in reality they just, chuck the macro lens in there as just a trick to be able to claim that higher number. A bonus fact is, if you're just trying to take a macro shot and you're trying to get up close to a subject, it will still retain a 1x zoom, even though it's just cropping in the 0.5x lens into the 1x for the maximum close-up that it can get, and sort of filling in the details with computational photography. It doesn't really generate more megapixels or crop a smaller part of the sensor, because oftentimes the ultra-wide camera is only 12 megapixels, and those are just fully utilized when you're taking at 0.5x. So coming in closer, 1x, it will still be the same 12 megapixels, just with a little bit more trickery. In the S25, for example, you have a larger amount of megapixels in the ultra-wide camera, so they can utilize and do some tricks when it comes to just choosing different pixels on the sensor, but most often it will still be just computational photography enhancing the final image. Keeping the lens choice theme, the second tip I would give you is, if you're trying to get the best depth of field possible, the most blurry out of focus, not using the portrait mode, you will oftentimes want to disable the automatically sort of toggling to macro mode and just stick to using the main sensor. Particularly higher end phones now have quite large sensors, and if you get just right up close to the limit of the minimum focus distance, that's where you're going to get the maximum of the background being out of focus, and sort of the most sort of creamier, and a lot of the adjectives that you hear about just an out of focus background, that's where you'll get the most. And if you have the macro lens sort of jumping around and sort of enabling the ultra wide when you get too close because it can't focus, you can sort of on the moment, you can just miss the shot and just take a ultra wide zoomed in shot, which is not really what you're trying to do when you just want beautiful bokeh. The third one is definitely more niche and a little bit confusing, but this has happened to every single one of you at one point or another, whether you've noticed it or not. And that's when it comes to HDR, anything, and the phone camera. Like, most photo sharing apps will struggle with handling all types of HDR that comes out of your phone camera. So it's quite common that you would take a picture and you would see it on like Google Photos on your Pixel device, and that photo will look brighter and more vivid than after you share it on, let's say, WhatsApp or Telegram. Certain social media apps know how to handle these HDR images, like Instagram tends to handle them decently well, but it will end up just having a weird image that sometimes gets recognized as HDR and sometimes it doesn't. But the worst offender is video, because if you have your videos taken in HDR by default, then sort of the SDR version of the video tends to be a little wonkier than the photos. Like, it's quite common to take HDR photos, and then if you send them to someone else, they just tend to be a slightly less bright version of the same image with less poppiness and contrast. But when it comes to video, sometimes you can get just weird compression just because of the way that tone mapping works when it's trying to squeeze the dynamic range into a smaller space in the SDR world, and that can create some weirdness. So By default, I usually turn off the HDR for video and I keep it for photos, but if you want to just make it a clearer, simpler, and just sort of more maximum compatibility mode, maybe turn off both, and you'll see how that goes. Not to be confused with the HDR image processing that happens with computational photography. This has nothing to do with that. It's just when it comes to the final image and how you perceive it, because just, HDR can be a beautiful thing, but if you've dealt with trying to understand HDR to any extent, you'd kind of figured out that it has to be compatible from the device that captures the media all the way until the device that's viewing the media, whether that being video or photos. They all have to speak the same language. Otherwise, it can create anything from slightly dimmer pictures to just green and purple jankiness when you're watching Dolby Vision content in a device that doesn't support it. And the fourth tip is in relation to night mode. And I still remember when Huawei launched their night mode feature and all other manufacturers were just scrambling for a couple of years to create something that looked similar or as good or now even better. But it's not magic. Like, all it does is mix up multiple pictures, and there are certain artifacts that are much better if they're simply not there. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're still taking a picture at night with your phone, nothing beats a steadier hand, holding down your breath, and lightly pressing on the shutter. Not like you don't actually have to do it, but some of the smearing, some of the loss of detail, and the over smudging that you can get with aggressive night mode is much diminished if it doesn't have to expose for, let's say, 3 seconds. If it only has to do it for 1, that's better. And bonus, if you want, and you can just lean your phone against something and take a picture remotely, whether that being using your watch or just putting it on a timer, that will be the cleanest your phone can take that picture at night. Every single time, night mode or no night mode. And number 5, let's talk about aspect ratios. Like, I tried to do some research and find some exceptions, and I couldn't really find any current phone that does not have a 4:3 sensor. I think Sony uses 3:2 sensors on their flagship smartphones, but most phones will use 4:3. And this is important because on most camera settings, you can be confused and tend to pick, let's say, 16:9 and take a rectangular photo that fills up more of your screen when you're taking the image and feel like you're getting a bigger image, or you're not cropping in as much because it's not a squarish shape in the middle. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Like, your sensor has a native aspect ratio. Just imagine your sensor as a tiny little square. It's a square rectangular-ish shape, and it's usually 4:3. So if you're taking a 16:9 photo natively, you're kind of just telling your phone that, the extra bits on top, just crop them away and make this a 16:9 photo. So it's never too late to just double check you're taking it in 4:3 and not in 1:1 or in 16:9. Later on, you can just crop it to whatever format you want, but you're losing a little bit of real estate if you're just cropping it on the moment of capture. And I guess when it comes to cropping and quality in the camera, it's never too late to remember that most phones will come filming in 1080p, so toggling it to 4K seems like probably a good idea if you're watching a video about camera settings and how to improve your smartphone photography. But a bonus tip that's slightly less known is smartphone cameras are a miracle when it comes to stabilizing video. Like, they do a ton of really clever things to make the footage look as smooth as humanly possible, but you lose some frame every time, no matter how much shakiness is happening. You can see that in most phones that have an active mode that zooms in an extra amount, but usually even the standard sort of stabilization crops in, let's say 20% or even 30% on the edge of the image. And usually if you have a way to lean your phone against something and you're trying to just maximize how wide you can capture on the main lens, which usually is the best lens, you oftentimes can get a decent chunk of just frame just by toggling off stabilization in the settings. It's usually called video stabilization in most phones, so it's pretty straightforward.